Hi everyone, this is Professor Hai Nguyen, and I want to welcome you back into another wonderful week that we are having here. We are going now into what I don't know, guys. I lost count. It's our seventh week. It just feels like it's the same thing over and over and over. Um, but patience, right? We got at least another month to go. We'll see how this thing plays out, but hope for the best, prepare for the worst, guys. This may look like it's going to be a while. So with that said, I want to welcome you back, and we want to somewhat pick up exactly where we left off last week, because what I'm hoping is that by the time you in watching this week's lecture, you will have everything you will need in order for you to somewhat complete midterm number two. I would say that prior to this week's lecture, you should have been around 85% of the content of the way there, looking at compare and contrast the effort of women and also African Americans in their quest to fulfill somewhat the promises of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So I want to get back here where we left off last week. Hang on one second here, guys. Okay, so I want to pick up where we ultimately left off last week, is that I think I got to right about at the apex of the civil rights movement, looking at the March on Washington, where you have more than 250,000 African Americans, but also both blacks and white. You have other minorities there as well, but you have the March on Washington. Let me see. Let me try to go back here if I can. Okay. So kind of refresh. Yeah, the March on Washington, right, where you have activists really trying to put pressure on the federal government to pass the Civil Rights Bill that would eventually become law in 1964. Part of the reason why the Civil Rights Bill passed has to do with the passing of JFK. And it's very ironic that in American history, it is a man from the South. You have Lyndon B. Johnson being JFK's successor, and then ultimately using his political will as a way to pressure Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill as a way to fulfill somewhat JFK's legacy. And the Civil Rights Bill forever somewhat changed America, simply because it banned segregation, it outlawed somewhat public accommodations from segregating people based on their color. Basically, it ended racial discrimination in American society, especially when it comes to government policies in particular. So it was an end to Jim Crow, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jim Crow went away. But this is where I want to pick up somewhat where we left off, is that I really want to focus on the slogan of the March on Washington, because you can make an argument that African Americans demanded somewhat for their right to be treated equally under the 14th Amendment, right? So that's where you have an end to segregation, because segregation was really a violation of African Americans under the 14th Amendment of being treated as equal, or at least equal protection before the law. Okay? So you have an end to segregation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the inequity somewhat just vanishes away. Is that, again, there was still a separation between white America and Black America. Black America was still somewhat behind in terms of income, in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare. Basically, every category statistically you can think of, African Americans were falling behind, with the exception of maybe flavor, culture, and swagger. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. Maybe that was something that they somewhat had more than whites. Let's just put it that way. But all joking aside, guys, economically, you can see that African Americans were falling behind. But this is where I want to focus on that slogan for the March on Washington. Again, the question becomes, how do African Americans catch up economically, right? We're talking about jobs here, guys, right? So maybe the government somewhat has an equal opportunity, somewhat system, if you will, that somewhat ban racial discrimination. But when it comes to the private sector, how does the government somewhat motivate or encourage or maybe pressure the private sector to hire Black. And this is the challenge. And I'm hoping you understand somewhat the evolution of the strategies that African Americans use. I mean, if you look at it, guys, you have African Americans, very early on, just getting the out of the South, right? Just leaving the South, right? Just get the hell out. And as they try to move to the North and they try to move to the West, right, as a way to find better pastures. African Americans will use somewhat the opportunities to go work in the war industries, but the war industries is only an opportunity during a time of war, right? So World War I, World War II. Now you can make an argument, well, what about the Cold War, Professor Nguyen? The Cold War is a little different. The Cold War was not so much it was not similar to World War I and World War II, where you have, Rosie the Riveter, and you have propaganda calling on somewhat people to go sign up for military services. You didn't have like meatless Mondays or anything like that, right? It's a much longer drag out, and also a war of ideologies. There's a reason why we call it the Cold War, guys, because the Cold War itself, it's simply because you have two superpowers that never really fought each other directly. You have the Americans, you have the Soviets, really fighting through their allies, right? We call it proxy war, right? So they would supply weapons, they would supply financial assistance to countries, right? China, Korea, Vietnam, so many other places, right? It's a proxy war, so it's a little different. So those war industry jobs are not really going to somewhat be an opportunity for African Americans to take full advantage of once the war comes to an end. And then on top of that, you can make an argument, well, Professor Nguyen, they can try to make a change by voting, right? Sure, right? You can go vote, and sometimes at work, 1948, you have the election of Harry Truman. But here's the problem, guys. Once these guys become president, they somewhat turn their backs, or at least tell African Americans that they have bigger priorities, or there are other things that they need to worry about. So they really somewhat betrayed, or at least leave African Americans hanging in terms of in terms of priorities for housing, jobs, and ending segregation for African Americans. So voting has its somewhat flaw, because sometimes the politician, once they get into office, right, they're already in office, so it doesn't really necessarily mean that they have to fulfill their promises. And then on top of that, if you look at voting itself, it's not like African Americans can just simply vote to end segregation. Here's the flaw when it comes to voting, guys, right? At the end of the day, how do you, as a minority group, all right, there's a reason why African Americans are called a minority group, and so many other people of color. It's simply because they are a minority group. They are not the majority, meaning that they don't surpass 50% of the population, okay? So how do you, as a minority group, which African Americans, I believe, are like 15%, okay? You got Hispanic and Latinx communities today at 12%. Asian Americans are at 5%. So how do you, as a minority group, right, 15%, 12%, 5%, accomplish a majority? Okay, basically, how do you convince white America? Look, at the end of the day, it's about convincing white America, because why? They have the vote, right? So when it comes to voting, there is a structural flaw. There's only so much you can do when it comes to voting, because at the end of the day, as long as you are the minority group, right, you are forever at the mercy of white America. That's how it works, guys, right? That's a democracy. In the democracy, if you want to pass a law, right, you need at least a majority, right? 50% plus one. Then the question becomes, even though you have African Americans wanting to end segregation, they simply can't just use the power of the ballot, right? The power of the vote, right? Because not by themselves, right? They would have to form some kind of coalition, either by joining the Chicano movement, the Asian American movement, or you have to convince white America that it is in their best interest, right, to do what you want. Okay, so at the end of the day, I think that's the flaw, guys, right? Voting. It only takes you so far, because in a democracy, guys, it's a simple arithmetic, right? It's a simple math. You need 50% plus one. And unfortunately, African Americans, they do not have that. They are not the majority. And as a result, white America after 1964 is really going to react in a negative way towards somewhat the civil rights movement, because the frustration builds, guys. Okay, the frustration builds because even though you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, okay, that doesn't necessarily mean white companies, white businesses, white owners, okay, are hiring African Americans. Okay, so and again, how do you pressure those private enterprise to hire blacks? How do you do that in a free market capitalistic society? This is the challenge. And even though you have programs such as affirmative action as a way to somewhat incentivize and give preference to minorities of color in the job, in the workplace and also in education, the attack or the criticism against affirmative action by white America is that it's reverse discrimination. That here you have African Americans being hired simply because they are black, right, at the expense of their white counterparts. So now it's reverse discrimination. So this is the challenge that we have, guys, right? So even though you have the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and it somewhat creates an equal opportunity for African Americans, that doesn't mean that they are somehow somewhat having equal access. And this is the challenge. The perfect metaphor is, I want you to think about those four guys, those four African-American activists that went inside of Woolworth's counter, okay? Sure, now that they are able to somewhat sit at the counter, okay, the question becomes, can they afford the burger, okay? And this is the challenge. And what you're going to see is that the civil rights movement is going to somewhat shift. No longer is it about just the South and ending segregation. Now, you accomplished that, right? The 1964 Rights Act accomplished to end somewhat segregation in the South. Well, here lies the problem, guys. There's a large segment of the African-American population outside of the South, in the North and in the West, especially in the inner cities. So the question is that ultimately, what are their living conditions? And sadly, here's where we're going to shift gears, and we're going to be looking at the origins of the urban riots in the 1960s. Because something really odd happens is that by the summer of 1965 and onward, right, from 1965 all the way up until 1968. So I apologize for somewhat the years there, right? 65 to 68. Every single summer, some city somewhere in America is going to burn up in flames, okay? Now, these riots themselves, part of it has to do with somewhat tension between the white and black communities, like many of the other riots that we have looked at before, right? The Tulsa, Oklahoma riot, the Detroit riot in 1943. There's been many other riots, right? You have St. Louis, Chicago in the 1919. You can even go back to the 1860s with the Memphis riot. But all of those riots, guys, prior to the 1960s, a good argument can be made that it was whites who instigated it. It was whites who uses violence as a way to terrorize African Americans and try to keep them in their place. The riots in the 1960s is a little bit different in this sense, is that it actually comes from the black communities itself. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why were African Americans burning up somewhat their portion of the city? Why was the inner cities burning up in flames? Now, it's easy to say that, well, it seems counterproductive that they would burn up somewhat their communities and their streets and somewhat their cities. But the question that you have to ask yourself is, in that tight cage, airtight cage of poverty, that's what Martin Luther King describes, okay? Now, Martin Luther King, he doesn't somewhat condone what African Americans in the inner cities are doing. He's against violence, right? He's against these riots, but he does understand their frustration. He says, look, I don't condone it, but I understand why they would do it. And that's what we want to focus on, guys, because why? It's still happening today, right? It was only about 5 years ago that Baltimore, Ferguson, right, and so many other cities throughout America burned up in flames. So what we're going to try to do is understand that through line, okay, and understand the economic conditions that would somewhat cause African Americans to burn up their cities in flames. Even though it looks counterproductive, the question becomes what other form of protests, right, do African Americans have at their disposal that they can use as a way to fight for their equality, right? Because again, they historically, they have already tried to move outside of the South into the North and into the West. Things are not better. They try to vote, but the politicians somewhat leave them hanging, or at least they don't have enough votes to accomplish what they want, right? And even when they get the votes, right, the policies often become somewhat not enforced, right, by the law, but by the somewhat law enforcement, also government agencies, okay? And then there is just simple matter of, again, how do you get white America, right, to hire Black, right, and provide education and provide somewhat healthcare and provide somewhat assistance for Black America to catch up, okay? Now, here's the thing I do want to make a difference is that sometimes when we think of the civil rights movement, the criticism of the civil rights movement or the confusion that people have about the civil rights movement is that African Americans were asking for something extra, okay? Like something extra, okay? Because that's the criticism that you hear today. Like, oh, why do African Americans have to demand for education? Why do they have to demand for housing? Why do they have to demand for jobs? Why can't they just go out and find it, okay? Here's the reality to such statement. It shows a lack of understanding of the historical inequalities that have always existed between Black America and white America, okay? Here's where I really want to make it clear to you. African Americans were not asking for anything extra. They were simply asking what white America have been receiving ever since the New Deal, okay? So here's where we want to look at the origins of the urban riots, okay? And the origins of the urban riot lies with these homes right here in the suburbs. The problem that you have in America is that in the 1930s, right? Well, actually starting in the 1920s, what you have is because of the Great Migration, you have the cities, right? Urban metropolises, New York, Chicago, Detroit, LA, San Francisco, okay? So many major urban cities outside of the South. You have an influx of African Americans entering into these cities. And what you have in the inner cities in the 1920s, in the 1930s, is that white and Blacks, even though they were segregated, okay, still live in the same city, somewhat city boundaries, okay? Meaning that they're still a part of a city jurisdiction. So what that means, they share resources, right? They use the same facilities, okay? And somewhat go to the same workplaces, okay? That's the point, right? So I want you to imagine like somewhat a city, right? You got both Blacks and whites living together. The problem that you have is that starting in the 1930s, because of government policies, I want to make that clear, okay? Because of government policies, assistance, subsidies, okay? What you have is that the US government, the national government, started to facilitate housing in the suburbs, okay? Housing in the suburbs. Now, these are areas outside of the inner cities. It's basically where we live today, guys, right? The suburbs. So for example, San Jose is a suburb, okay? Fremont is a suburb, okay? Okay, it's an outer area away from the traditional monopolises, okay? Metropolises, I'm sorry, okay? So what you have is, it was the US government that subsidized, funded, and assisted what we call white flight, okay? White flight. These were the millions, okay, tens of millions of white Americans who were able to somewhat move to the suburbs, buy a home, and accomplish the American dreams. And somewhat the old understanding, or at least since the 1980s, right, you have this idea of the rugged individual, right? This somewhat comes from like Ronald Reagan. He was the one that elevated its mantra. The idea is, you don't need government assistance, right? You just got to work hard, pull yourselves up by the bootstrap, and voila, right? You're going to get rewarded with this. Here lies the problem, guys. That mantra, right, is not reality. The reality of it is that ever since the 1930s, affirmative action, okay, the idea that the government would give preference, okay, to a certain group of people, okay, have been happening since the 1930s. It's quite ironic that whites today oppose affirmative action, or at least the conservative ones, okay, oppose affirmative action. Because in the 1930s, you can make an argument that the original recipient or those who benefited from affirmative action were white Americans themselves. So this is how it goes, guys. So I'm going to go step by step how the federal government subsidized, assisted, right, and facilitated, okay, white America's elevated white America to middle class. The middle class would not have been possible without government assistance. Don't believe in any of this bullshit that you hear that, they work harder. And look, nobody's denying that work is not part of the formula, but it takes more than just hard work, guys, okay? Housing has to be subsidized, okay? Lending, right? Mortgages has to be somewhat insured, okay? Loans, okay, have to be somewhat insured, okay? Jobs have to be somewhat created. And all of that comes from the federal government. So what do we call that concept when somebody, right, receives financial assistance from the government? We call it welfare. But sadly today, we only think of welfare as people of color. So here we go, step by step. When affirmative action was white, okay? You start in the 1930s because what do you have? The New Deal program, guys, okay? You have the New Deal relief and work programs, right? Very similar to what's going on today with the government sending out stimulus checks, right, to everybody so that way they can somewhat stay afloat. During the 1930s, under FDR, you have 21 work programs, okay? $30 billion, okay? Invested, spent on providing relief, okay, assistance to America. Now, you can make an argument that the New Deal relief measures itself was not designed to be racist. It's not. It's not. The way that the language is written, it's not. But here lies the problem, guys. What the problem is that the federal government gave out money. But it gave out money to local governments, state governments, in the hands of local politicians. So that way they can redistribute it. The problem that you have with that, even though the law is not designed to be somewhat racist, well, those people that implemented the program, sadly, they were, okay? So as a result, what you have is that, unfortunately, some of this money did not trickle its way down to Black America, okay? And we already talked about how some of the work programs during the New Deal excluded African Americans. Social Security, minimum wage, labor unions, okay? You even have certain industries somewhat being impacted where minimum wage did not apply to African Americans simply because of the nature of their work, agriculture and somewhat domesticity, okay? So you have the New Deal relief work programs going primarily to white recipients, okay? That's number one. So $30 billion during the New Deal. Next phase, World War II. Once again, $300 billion spent on the war effort, okay? Redistributing more than $150 billion in the pockets of the American workers. Now, it benefited both whites and blacks, okay? But the point I'm trying to make here is don't forget, guys, that whites benefited as well, okay? So you have money from the New Deal. You have money from World War II, okay, being spent, put into the hands of recipients, both whites, well, majority of them whites, sometimes blacks. So World War II, okay, putting people back to work. Then the next phase, okay, the GI Bill, 1944, okay, $95 billion. And to put it in today's value, that's $1.8 trillion. So if you thought what was the stimulus bill? It was like $2 trillion? Yeah, $2 trillion, okay? So the GI Bill, 1944, okay? The GI Bill is going to be responsible for putting millions of Americans to college, okay? So I have the statistics here for you from 1944 to 1956, more than 7.8 million veterans went to college. So the GI Bill, it provided access to college education. College education prior to World War II was a luxury, only for the rich. But because of the GI Bill and because of the federal government subsidizing the GI Bill, now college become a human right, right? Like a right that you have as a veteran, okay? And look, I have no problem with that. Okay, I have no problem. Look, if you put your life on the line, you deserve a college education, okay? But in addition to a college education, guys, the GI Bill also offer low finance home mortgage loans, okay? So you have more than 2.4 million mortgages, okay? Mortgages being issued, subsidized, lent out to by the GI Bill, okay? And guys, even the mortgage itself, how you bought a home. So I'll get to that in a little bit. So let me recap that. The New Deal, World War II, the GI Bill, all provided funding, subsidies, assistance, financial assistance for white Americans, okay? Some blacks, okay? To what? Get jobs, put money in their pocket, go to college, okay? And buy a home. Now, the GI Bill, again, it's not the fact that the GI Bill was written to be racist. It's not, okay? But the problem is its implementation at a local state level, okay? The people who implemented the program, the people who were in charge of the money at a local and state level, oftentimes discriminated against Black applications. And here's where you might want to think about segregation and how it plays into somewhat access to education. So let's say you're a Black veteran. You come home after World War II and you want to go to college. The problem with that is that Black veterans, once they came home, there weren't enough colleges for them to go to. Because why? Colleges were separated. Guys, that's why we have HBCUs, right? Historically Black college universities. These are Black universities that were designed to allow African Americans to pursue a higher education. The problem that you have is that after World War II, even though you have some African Americans being accepted into white universities, it's not enough. Black universities were at max capacity. They could not somewhat add more seats to their campus because, again, you need funding for that. So as a result, you have hundreds of thousands of African American veterans unable to go to school simply because of occupancy. There's only so many seats in a classroom, guys. There's only so many Black college universities across America. And the problem is that after World War II, do you have an expansion of the education system? Yes, you do. But the problem was, come on, guys, you already know it by now, separate but unequal. A lot of the funding went to build white campuses, okay, to facilitate and accommodate white students in particular. Black colleges remain the same, even though enrollment is through the roof because of the GI Bill. And as a result, there is a clog in the system because of somewhat segregation. right? So I hope you understand that it's not that the law is somewhat written to be racist, but its implementation, right, was somewhat unequal. Okay, so you have somewhat this fast track for white America to get jobs, to get money, to get a college education, right? And you got to think about what happens when you get a college education. Well, when you get a college education, what that allows you to do is to move away, right, or transition from what we call blue collar jobs, so manufacturing. So maybe before the war, right, you were working in the assembly line in the city of Detroit, right? You're just putting a tire on a car. But the fact that you are going to college now, you have a higher education degree. So what does that mean? Now you can become what we call a white collar sector job, right? These are the office's jobs. So now you're an accountant. Now you are an engineer, right? Now you are somewhat a scientist, right? A chemist, right? Now you are somewhat a Wall Street stock trader, something of that nature, right? But I want to focus on that engineering jobs, right? So even getting your college degree was subsidized by the federal government through the GI Bill. And I want you to think about the type of jobs that these guys are going to be getting, especially during the Cold War. Because you think about the Cold War, guys, we talked about this. The good thing about a war is that it's a tremendous stimulus to the economy. And when you are in a war, right, you want to beat your opponent by having innovations, the latest technology, right? We already talked about somewhat the military industrial complex. This is when your economy is based on military inventions, right? Or at least it's the military, the funding that comes from the military that ultimately drives your economy. And guys, that's exactly what happens. Because there is another law. So here you have what in 1960, this is the National Defense Education Act. And the National Defense Education Act is even going to expand further on providing education to white America. With the National Defense Education Act, you no longer have to be a veteran in order for you to somewhat go to college for free, okay? As an effort to beat the Russians into space, right? That's what the battle is, guys, right? During the Cold War, it's a competition of ideology, but also society. Who is more advanced? Who is more superior? And the fact that in 1957, the Russians managed to send a satellite into the sky, America freaks out, it panics, and as a result, it's going to try to catch up to the Russians. And how are you going to do that? You're going to invest in education, in the science, STEM field, right? Engineering, okay, research and development. And who is the biggest recipient of this? Guys, it's the UC system, okay? You have Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford. Well, Stanford's a private school, but still, they're able to receive government subsidies. And if they accept these government subsidies, they will have to somewhat invest in research and development for the military. So you think about some of the jobs that these guys are getting, right? If you're an engineer, you're a chemist, you're a scientist, and you're working in these labs at the fancy universities, guys, that money is coming from the military. Make no confusion, okay? And who funds the military? It's the US government, guys. All right, so even the jobs that these guys are working, right, is subsidized by the federal government. I want you to think about Orange County in particular. There's a reason why, guys, Orange County in Southern California is such a staunch, somewhat Republican base. It's simply because a lot of them are anti-communist, right? But down in Orange County, guys, is also a manufacturing plant for some of the biggest aerospace companies that we have, okay? So you have Boeing, you have somewhat Lockheed, Douglas Martin, you have Rocketdyne, even NASA, okay? They all have somewhat offices. They all have somewhat testing grounds down there. So you think about these jobs, right? White collar, right? In research and development, in the science field, in somewhat engineering. Guys, these companies are subsidized by the federal government. So what that means is that, right, it's welfare. That's what it is, guys. Even though, you're not receiving like paper booklets or EBT cards or anything like that, when you're receiving money, or at least your job, right? Your job is paid for by the government, guys. That is welfare. Okay. So you got the college degree, got the job, you're making more money. Now the question becomes, well, what are you going to do with that? Of course, guys, you're going to buy a home, right? You're going to buy a home. And that's exactly what they did, right? Homes were built, subsidized, once again, by the federal government. 1933, you have the creation of what is called the Federal Housing Administration, okay? The Federal Housing Administration. And their job is simple: to promote home construction in America. That's their job, right? Build more homes. And how are you going to do that? You're going to subsidize the home construction industry, okay? By pumping in billions of dollars to incentivize, to assist, and to subsidize builders to build more homes. It's that simple. So the Federal Housing Administration, how did it do this? Well, a couple of ways. It is going to ensure how you buy a home, okay? Maybe some of you are not familiar, but this is how you buy a home. You got to go to the bank, okay? You got to go to the bank and you got to apply for what is called a mortgage. Now, the idea of the mortgage, okay? So today, the idea of a mortgage is that you get 30 years, okay? Fixed interest rates, meaning that your interest rates will never change. Set payments, stretch out 30 years. You got 30 years to pay off a home. So for example, my wife and I, we bought a condo, a 2-bedroom condo, right, for $700,000. Or APR, I believe it's at 3.75. That was the APR that we recently refinanced. 30 years, okay? We have somewhat to pay, and my mortgage every month is around $3,900, okay? $3,900. So, yeah, I'm not rich, guys. We're barely making it. But anyways, so that's the modern, somewhat mortgage. Here's the difference. Prior to the Federal Housing Administration, how you buy a home was completely different. Instead of 30 years, what they gave you was 15 years, or if not less, 15, 10, somewhere around there, okay? And instead of a fixed interest rate, we call it balloon interest rates. And what it means is that you start off somewhat kind of low, okay, like a low rate, and then like a balloon, if you blow air to it, it expands. That's the metaphor. Over time, your interest rates will go up. Why are they going to go up? That is the lender's way of putting pressure on you to pay off your loan as soon as possible. Because why? A lender wants to get that money as soon as possible, okay? So if you think about that, that's a really somewhat challenging and problematic way to own a home, because again, you're feeling the pressure. It's 15 years, and the longer you take, the higher your payments are going to be. So it's really somewhat challenging for people to buy homes. The best way to do it was simply you either have to pay for a home up front, okay, or come up with a really large down payment, which most people didn't have. Now, this is where I say the FHA changed the game. It changed the game. Because instead of 15 years, now you got 30. Instead of balloon payments, now you got fixed interest rates. So it gives you stability. But guys, make no confusion. The mortgage, the idea of a mortgage, 30-year fixed interest rate, that was something that was subsidized, okay, and insured by the federal government. Okay? That's how it works. The federal government basically created the FHA. It somewhat lent out to the banks and said, look, just give out these loans, 30 years. And if the borrower should default on their homes, it's okay. Okay? It's okay because why? There's a pool of insurance money that you can dip into. We will somewhat cover the cost. So what does that mean? It incentivizes banks to give out longer loans, because when there's a safety net, right, created by the federal government, banks got nothing to worry about. It's a win-win situation. Okay, so it's easier for you to somewhat buy a home because why? You have the GI Bill subsidizing, right, allowing you to have somewhat no down payment, low interest rates, and even your loan itself, the mortgage, is stretched out by 30 years. So guys, it's a win-win for Americans. Well, white Americans in particular. That's how they're able to own a home. Okay, so you got your job now, you're making the money, and now you're able to buy the home. And even when you buy the home, every year, okay, you as a homeowner, so yes, me, every year, the interest that you pay, okay, you can claim it on your taxes. So what that means is that you write down how much interest and you pay, and the government will give you a deduction, okay? It incentivizes people to own homes, but it also put homeowners at an advantage over who? Over people who rent. This is why, guys, don't be a sucker. You want to own a home, okay? And you think about a home, it's not just a roof over your head, guys, but I want you to think of a home as a giant savings account that you're throwing your money under. That's what it, or into, okay? So once you own a home, the fact that you own a home, it's basically the mortgage interest tax deduction. It's basically the government's way of giving you money back, okay? Yes, interest that you pay, but still the government saying, you know what? We see that you're paying interest on your loan. It's okay. Here is some money back, okay? Renters, you don't get shit. Right? You don't get nothing, okay? The government is not going to sympathize with you or give you a deduction simply because you're paying rent. That's not how it works. So there's an advantage, guys, right? So owning a home, okay? So now you got your home in the suburb, but let's just say that maybe your job is still in the city. So maybe you live in, let's say, I don't know, San Mateo, but your job is still in San Francisco, okay? It's a long drive, okay? It's a long drive, okay? Well, even the very roads that you drive on was subsidized by the federal government, okay? The interstate system, okay? You guys ever driven on 680, 280, 880, 580, right? 80, okay? Anything with a red, white, and blue logo, guys, that was built during the 1950s, the interstate system. Okay, 10 lanes wide to somewhat facilitate movement of people and cars back and forth between the suburbs and the cities. 41,000 miles, all built across America, subsidized by the federal government. So even the roads to facilitate the movement of whites to the suburbs was built by the federal government, okay? Was built by the federal government. Okay, and then you think about going to work, okay? Healthcare, Social Security, okay? Retirement, healthcare benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, 1965. That was subsidized by the federal government, okay? Social Security, okay? That is also funded by the government. Now, we all pay into it, but still, that is a program that is run by the government, okay? So, you got your job, you got money, you got your home, you even have the roads to allow you to go back and forth, okay? That's middle-class America, right, guys? And then that home, okay? That home that you have, guys, it's not just a roof over your head. You pay that loan. Okay? You think about a home. Once you finish that loan, what can you do with that house? Guys, a home, what we're talking about is multi-generational wealth. Yes, you get to live in it. But if you pay off your mortgage 30 years down the road, you have yourself a nice family. Well, guess what that means? You have built what we call equity, okay? Because when you buy a home, guys, it's not just the amount that you pay. That's what you want. No. Okay? all homeowners, okay, want their homes to increase in property value. Yes, every year my home gets assessed by the county and they give me the worth, the value of my home, okay? So for example, I bought my home for $700,000 in 2018, okay, 2018. When the market was hot, in a matter of 4 months, this is how batshit crazy housing is in the Bay Area, guys. This is how bad, yeah, I'm sorry I'm using cuss words. Oh, I apologize if there are kids in the class, okay? In a matter of 4 months, my condo, okay, retail, market value, I could have sold it to somebody else, okay, for a price of $900,000. So in a matter of 4 months, if I decided to sell my home, I could have made an easy $200,000 simply because I signed on the dotted line and I bought a home. So you think about it, okay? I could have made $200,000 in a matter of 4 months. That is somewhat equity, right? That we have. So when you look at housing itself, guys, housing is not just about a roof over your head. It's about profits, okay? Money, wealth that you can accumulate in your lifetime. And not only can you accumulate it for yourself, but once you finish paying off that home, you can pass that on to your children, okay? Something to think about. Hang on one second, guys. Look like I have a little interruption here. I apologize about that, guys. The wonders of teaching at home with a 2-year-old. So I apologize if my daughter screaming made it through the video. So let me try to pick up where I last left off. The point that I'm trying to make is that owning a home, right? What we're talking about is multi-generational wealth because, again, the goal of a homeowner is not only to just somewhat pay off his loan, what a homeowner ultimately want is for his or her property value to somewhat go up higher by the time that the loan ends. So again, it's about building equity, right? And equity is somewhat the money that you have somewhat accumulated because the amount that you pay into your mortgage, but also the increase in value of your home. Now, why is that important for us to understand? That is important for us to understand. It's simply because, again, that is somewhat wealth that you can accumulate. Now, the question is that how does that exacerbate somewhat the division that already occurred between white and Black America? Well, here's the problem that you have is that starting in the 1950s, you have this massive migration that every single city across America, with the exception of LA, but if you know anything about LA, it's not that it didn't happen. It's just LA, instead of somewhat people migrating outside of its boundaries, LA just decided that it's just going to incorporate all of the areas around its boundaries. So it's a little bit deceiving, if you will. But if you look at every major American city across America, right, you can see that there is a loss of residents in its city. It's simply because tens of millions of Americans were moving to the suburbs. So if you look at 1950 to 60, 20 million, okay? By 1970, 74 million Americans. And even up until today, by the year 2000, you have more than half of Americans living in the suburbs. Now, why is that important for us to understand? Guys, it's not just about people moving to the suburbs, because as a homeowner, okay, you also pay taxes. It's called property taxes, and property taxes goes towards paying services, right? Public services such as education, okay, police, right, fire departments, and roads, infrastructure, and basically just a lot of things that we use in society. I mean, for God's sake, guys, I had to pay $600 last year just to somewhat for them to maintain 2 sewers that I have down below my condo. Guys, what is this saying in California, or at least Southern California? It never rains in Southern California. I mean, the Bay, we get a little bit more rain, but still, you get the idea here is that you have property taxes go to pay for public services. So what becomes the problem now is that even though you have millions of white Americans, right, they're not just taking themselves to the suburbs. They're taking what? Property taxes along with them to the suburbs, because instead of paying in the city, right, now they're paying in the suburbs to provide services that in their community, which I get it, okay? But they're also taking sales taxes, okay? They're not buying stuff because why? They're not living in the cities anymore. They're living in the suburbs. So it's property tax, it's sales tax, okay? But also, guys, if you're a business and you know that people are moving to the suburbs and that's where they're gonna live, well, if you're a business owner, if you're a smart business owner, what is your next move? You're gonna move along with them. So it's not just taxes, it's also businesses, right, that were moving to the suburbs, okay? Okay, businesses. So what does that mean? Jobs, okay? Jobs are now moving to the suburbs because why? That's where majority of Americans were living. So it's taxes, it's jobs, right? It's income, but also, guys, it's also services, okay? Cities are losing money simply because residents are moving away outside of the city limits. And as a result, right, you have a decrease in government somewhat funding. And when a local city government doesn't have money, well, guess what? Education, roads, okay? Jobs, okay? Many of the things that we somewhat use are going to be neglected. And that's the point, guys. It's more than just people. It's taxes, it's money, it's jobs, it's services, right? Businesses all moving to the suburbs. So the question becomes, okay, all right, what is happening in the inner cities? What are African Americans doing? And maybe some of you are wondering, well, you keep saying white flight, white flight. Why is it only white people that were moving to the suburbs? Why couldn't African Americans, okay, simply pick up their bags and just go to the suburbs? It's not that easy, guys. And this is where I want to point out the flaw in the idea of the rugged individual. This idea that you can just pull yourselves up by the bootstrap and just go to the suburb and just work your way hard, right? Work your way up, work really hard, and you're going to get rewarded. That's not how it works, guys. Because here's the problem with the suburbs. The suburbs were not designed to integrate, meaning they're not designed to somewhat bring white and black America together. The suburbs itself had its exclusion. We call it restrictive covenant. Now, whether you know it or not, right, when you buy a home, you can't just do whatever the hell you want with your home. So for example, I'm a Raider fan, okay? Don't even ask me why, okay? I'm paying back all my karma of being a Laker fan, but I'm a Raider fan. So as much as I want to hang out some banners off of my balcony to show my black and silver pride, if you will, okay? When you buy a home, there's a lot of agreements that you have to somewhat agree to. There's a lot of conditions that you have to somewhat consent to. It's simply because builders and also homeowners, we want to increase the value of our home. And what drives value of our homes is uniformity, meaning that every building looks the same, okay? Yeah, you can have a plant off of your balcony, but you can't have like, gardens, going down or anything like that. So in my somewhat condo complex, every home looks the same. I have a little patch of rocks in front of my door. I can't even put a gnome. I can't even put a political somewhat sign, nothing, right? Can't do anything. And if I violate those conditions, if I decided to hang a flag of the Raiders off of my balcony, and if I decided that I'm going to put a giant gnome in front of my somewhat home, then the homeowners association reserve the right to kick me out. That's how it works. Now, we're not talking about we're not talking about a Raider flag here, guys. We're not talking about gnomes. But when you buy a home in the 1950s, the builders, okay, the guys that built the home, okay, and also the banks, the people that lend out the money so you can buy the home. And then on top of that, the government, the ones that were somewhat subsidizing your loans, subsidizing the homes that people were buying, they all required that new homeowners have to agree to a thing that was called restrictive covenant. And what a restrictive covenant does is that it requires the buyer to agree to certain conditions. And one of those conditions were, do not sell, rent, or lease your home to a person of color. That's right. African Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans were not allowed to buy a home in the suburbs. Okay? Simply because the law did not allow it. Okay? And then on top of that, the homeowners did not allow it because the belief was, if you bring in people of color into your white neighborhood, right? Historically, guys, what is the perception of people of color, right? We bring crime, we bring drugs, right? We bring trouble, right? Let's face it, minorities, right? People of color, we talk a certain way, we walk a different way, right? We got a certain culture, right? It's about the culture, okay? But the point is, if you add people of color in this neighborhood, now I would say it just brings the neighborhood more flavor, right? Give it a little bit more swagger, but that's another story. That's my personal opinion. But, right, if you add people of color into a white neighborhood, it is no longer uniform. And people of color back in the day, okay, depreciate. It lowers the value of your home. And this is the complexities, guys, right? This is the exacerbation of the division that already existed prior to the 1950s and 60s. And it only gets worse because what you have is white America is on a fast track to the suburbs, better jobs, better income, better housing, okay? More money, right? Mortgage deduction, right? Equity, okay? The problem was these homes, and even the builders, as sympathetic as they were. So you have the most famous suburbs in America, the Levitt towns. These were built by the Levitt brothers. They're Jewish. Now, nobody knows discrimination more than the Jewish people, right? So even though the Levitt brothers, even though they're sympathetic to African Americans and so many other people of color, guys, at the end of the day, this is capitalism. You build homes because you want to make money, not because somehow you have a philosophical, somewhat, ideology. No, it's about making money. So even though the Jewish, the Levitt brothers, they sympathize with African Americans, and as the statement I have here, right, from the Levitt, William Levitt, he says, as a Jew, I have no room in my mind for racial prejudice. But I have come to know that if we sell one house to a Negro family, then 90 or 95% of our white customers will not buy a home in the community. This is their attitude, not ours. Okay? And as a company, our position is simply this: we can solve the housing problem. They can build more homes. Or we can try to solve the racial problems, but you can't do both. They're conflicting. Okay? So that's the challenge, right? So this idea that people of color devalue the home of the white community. Well, where does that idea come from? Guys, this is where we get to these maps, okay? And this is where it gets back to that Federal Housing Administration. That Federal Housing Administration, what it did was, in order for it to somewhat lend out money to the banks, okay? For them to somewhat lend out money to the people who wants to buy a home. Well, the government is not in the business of losing money, guys. The government is in the business of building more homes. building more homes that are somewhat successful and somewhat will increase in value, okay? But just the idea that people of color represents somewhat danger, represents somewhat a threat, and represent a depreciation of your property, that idea comes from the government. So in the 1930s, what the government, right, the FHA, it had to figure out what neighborhood was somewhat safe to build in, what neighborhood was good to invest in, and what neighborhood to stay the hell away, okay? Bad for business. Banks should not be somewhat lending here, right? It's not worth your time. It's not worth your investment. Go somewhere else. And this is where the practice of redlining come in. Basically, the US government, it mapped out all of the residential neighborhood and it color-coded the residential neighborhood. I want you to think of it as best, good, okay, and stay the hell away. Okay? So the green and the blue that you see there, green is excellent. This is the neighborhood that you want to invest in because why, right? The property value will go up, okay? It's an excellent neighborhood, okay? Because of its facilities, because of its surroundings, where it's located. Blue, it's good, but it's not as good as green, okay? It's still good enough to invest in. You can still make some money if you're the banks, okay? So it's a good investment. Yellow, dicey, okay? Yellow is dicey. Yellow is okay. You can invest in these neighborhoods. You can give loans to these neighborhoods. You might not make as much money, but it's okay. But it is the red, guys. That's where you want to pay attention to. The red is basically exactly what the color sounds like. Stay the hell away from this neighborhood. This neighborhood is not worth it. This neighborhood is not a good investment, okay? This neighborhood is not the area that you want to somewhat give out loans, right? Give out money to people to borrow, okay? And as a result, right? You can see that the government is being arbitrary here. Now the question becomes, well, what dictates what neighborhood gets a red color and what dictates what neighborhood gets a blue color and green? I think you can already guess. You can actually find out on your own. So guys, there's an excellent database which I will share with you down below. It's called Mapping Inequalities. And what you can do is you can actually go to somewhat your city, right? So you got to think it's got to be major cities, right? San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco. You can pull it all up and they will explain to you the indicators or the explanation as to why the government agency had labeled this neighborhood this color. And time again, and I actually did this myself. I went on there and every single red block that you see right on the side, it always says Negro. Black. That's the reason why, guys. Why neighborhoods were color-coded red. It's a crime to be black. That's what it is. Black people were viewed as dangerous. Black neighborhoods were viewed as somewhat crime-ridden, okay? And African Americans, okay, were viewed as somewhat inferior. And that's what dictates the color. So if you look at it, guys, it exacerbates the problem, right? Not only do you have, so this is the government being arbitrary. This is not equal protection, guys, okay? Because this is basically the government's way of saying, you know what, if you live in the green neighborhood, here's more money. Or at least here's easier access to somewhat for you to buy a home, okay? And for you to accumulate wealth. But if you live in the black neighborhood, you're not going to be able to get a loan, okay? And since you're not going to be able to get a loan, well, guess what? It's going to be harder for you to buy a house. And even when you will buy a house, that loan itself is not going to be somewhat subsidized, or at least it's not a mortgage. You're going to have to pay off the loan very quickly, okay? And as a result, it made it incredibly hard for African Americans to buy a home. And even when you bought a home in these areas, if you're African Americans, the white owner, they know that you are at their mercy. So instead of selling their home for what it's actually worth, they would gouge you and sell at a price maybe a time and a half the value or 2 times the value of the home. Because at the end of the day, guys, they want to make more money. So make a long story short here, Black America, it became really hard to buy a home. And even when they could buy a home, right, the loan was not somewhat flexible. And then even when they buy a home, that home itself was inflated. And then on top of that, even if you buy a home in these neighborhoods, well, guess what? The fact that your government, okay, is not investing in this neighborhood, the education, right, law enforcement, firefighters, okay, lack of somewhat investment on the city's part, your home is not going to appreciate in value. Okay, so I'll explain to you my dilemma in a little bit, somewhat at the end of the lecture, as to what decision I should have made, okay, where I was going to live. Because guys, it's a very sad story, because as much as we like to think that we are an integrated society today, we're actually really not. That these colors still exist. They may not exist within a city, but now what you have is segregation by cities. Come on, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? The whites live on one side of town, Asians live on the other side of town, the blacks live on the other side of town. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yes, redlining, this was a very discriminatory practice. It made it really hard for African Americans to get access to housing. It forced them to rent, okay? And on top of that, their community is decaying. It's simply because, again, the government does not feel that it is worth their time to invest in these neighborhoods. I'm also going to share with you a clip that talks about somewhat the city of Detroit, okay, from the Eyes on the Prize. So I really recommend that you check it out, because it's going to look at the root of the Detroit riot in 1967. So I really recommend you somewhat check out that clip, because it's really going to look at the Detroit riot in the 1960s in particular. So you have these restrictive covenants. And guys, it's really enforced by the government here. So here's where I want to talk to you about the city of Detroit. If you guys remember, we talked about the Detroit riot in 1943, right? When you have black and white coming into the city of Detroit, competing for jobs, competing for housing, and it led to a deadly riot. One of the lessons that was learned from the Detroit riot in 1943 is that government officials realized we got to try to keep black and white apart as much as we can, because it might lead to violence if they somewhat come too close to each other. And then on top of that, you have white flight in the city of Detroit. You have thousands of white Detroiters moving out of the city of Detroit to go to the suburbs. And as a way to separate themselves from somewhat blacks Detroiters, and also as a way to somewhat allow white Detroiters to maintain their property value, because again, guys, if you allow African Americans to come into your neighborhood, it is going to depreciate the value of your home. So here's where I want to introduce to you somewhat the 8-mile wall that was built after the 1940s as a way to separate black and white Detroit apart from each other. This wall was required by the banks and also the FHA. If the builders wanted to build homes, they had to ensure to the banks and also the FHA that it was going to build this wall as a way to somewhat separate blacks and white apart from each other, to prevent blacks from owning homes in white neighborhoods, so that way it could maintain its property value. Now, there were examples of some liberal-minded white owners that decided that they're going to rent their homes out to African-American residents. So if it's not the wall that kept African-Americans out, if it's not the restrictive covenant that kept African-Americans out, at the end of the day, guys, what works is violence. African-American residents in white neighborhoods find themselves being targeted, their home being vandalized. You have teenagers throwing rocks okay, as a way to harass these Black homeowners. So at the end of the day, it's violence. Okay. So I hope you understand that segregation between white America and Black America. So you have white flight, subsidized, assisted by the federal government. FHA, New Deal programs, World War II, GI Bill, National Defense Act, okay, mortgage interest deduction, okay, the mortgage itself, the jobs that these men were working in, the military-industrial complex, even the roads that they drove on was built by the federal government. And even their property value was maintained by the federal government. Now the question becomes, what's happening to Black America in the inner cities? Because you got to remember, they can't leave. They can't just pack their bag and move to the suburbs, guys, right? So this is where you have that separation. Whites in the suburbs, they're going to be called the silent majority because, you know, they're living in the suburbs. It's nice, it's quiet, right? And also they're not protesting out. They're not protesting out the street because why would they? What are they going to protest about? Okay. And here's where I want to talk about Black America for a little bit. So you have somewhat their neighborhoods being neglected. You have restrictive covenant that prevents them from leaving. You have jobs moving away to the suburbs. You have a decrease in funding in terms of the local government. And as a result, housing, schools, roads were decaying simply because local city government did not have the funding in order for them to somewhat provide these services. So you have decaying infrastructure. And it's ironic because those decaying infrastructure is going to be the reason why, an excuse for the federal government to come in to destroy Black neighborhoods even further. The fact that, oh, you know, in the inner city, it's so ghetto, right? You have decaying somewhat homes, you have decaying neighborhoods, the road sucks. So you have a program in the 1960s, it's called urban renewal. Urban renewal, I want you to think of it as basically the federal government coming in and rebuilding. But the problem is, what are they rebuilding? High-risers, condominiums, but also freeways, okay? So if you're gonna build a 10-lane freeway to facilitate the movement of white Americans from the suburbs to the cities for work, for shopping, whatever it may be, and if you're the somewhat builder of the freeway, which neighborhood would you build through? Would you build through the white neighborhood that still exists in the city, or would you build through the Black neighborhood? And this is why, guys, if you've ever driven on 880, 280, and as you're driving into Oakland and as you're driving into San Francisco, look around you. Look at the neighborhoods that the freeway is cutting right through, okay? So I will share with you another video in terms of the impact, the negative impact that the interstate system had on African-American neighborhoods in the inner cities, because they literally build right through the heart of the community. So they use what is called eminent domain. So the concept of eminent domain allows the federal government to take over private property for public use. So you have the government, sure, they are buying homes and property from these Black neighborhoods, if you will, but they are not paying at somewhat market value, okay? And that's the problem that you have, is that it's called urban renewal, or African Americans call it Negro removal. This is where the federal government comes in, it demolishes Black neighborhoods to build sky-risers, condominiums, somewhat shopping, somewhat complexes, but also freeways as well. So I guess you can call it what we call it today, gentrification. This is when you have somewhat affluent, businesses, but today it's workers who are moving into minority neighborhoods, right, and pushing them out. But it's very similar. So you have urban renewal, right, destroying their neighborhoods. And then on top of that, you have jobs now moving to the suburbs, manufacturing jobs, businesses, okay, sales jobs, retailers, okay, moving to the suburbs. If not to the suburbs, starting in the 1980s and the 1990s, they're moving overseas to Mexico, to Canada, and by 1990s to China. So the very jobs that African Americans were working in as a way to escape from Jim Crow South, right, war industries, manufacturing, were now gone. Okay, we're now gone. So what are you watching? Your neighborhood decaying, okay? You have the government coming in, demolishing your neighborhood, okay, to build somewhat new ones for others, for businesses, okay? And then you're watching jobs leaving. So the opportunities you have are gone, or at least diminishing. That's what Martin Luther King was talking about when he says African Americans were trapped in an airtight cage of poverty. They have nowhere to go, right? Like, where do they go? They can't go to the suburbs, okay? What are they going to do? They're going to go back to the South, right? They can't move to the suburbs. They're watching their society decaying in front of them. They're losing jobs, or at least the jobs that they have are not well paying, okay? Services are declining, housing, roads, infrastructure. And last but not least, what's the one problem that I haven't even talked about yet, guys? That's affecting Black America as well. Police brutality. You have law enforcement, okay? Because of the somewhat decaying infrastructure, rise in poverty. Well, when you're broke, you're poor, and you don't have a job, right? What else can you do? Time and time, we see crime on the rise, right? Because people are going to do what they're going to do in order for them to survive, whether that's stealing, whether that's drug dealing, whatever it may be. And as a result, it reinforces once again the stereotype that African Americans are dangerous, right? Crime-ridden. Okay. And what's the response to that? A heavy hand of law enforcement, law and order. So we're talking about police brutality. Right? And you look at it, it shouldn't surprise you that African Americans have a very somewhat tense relationship with the police. Because if you think about the police, right, to serve and protect, that's what a policeman is supposed to do. But if you look at the origins of America's police force, we're talking about the origin, like back in the 19th century, they're militias, they're patrolmen, they're overseers, slave catchers. That was why the police was created, guys. So the relationship between the police, law enforcement, and African Americans have been tense, conflicting, and violent since day number one. Make no confusion, guys. Right? So you have police brutality. The very people who are assigned to protect you are the very ones who are harassing you, beating you, and also killing you as well. But back in the day, right, they didn't just kill you somewhat like today with a gun. Back in the day, they used to do what is called a chokehold. Okay, when they arrest you, right, to subdue a suspect, police were authorized to use a technique that was called the chokehold. So they would just choke you until somewhat you are subdued. But the problem is oftentimes, right, when you resist, they choke even harder, right? So I want you to think of Eric Garner in 2015 when the police tried to subdue him on the ground and they tried to somewhat restrain him. They choked him. And as a result, he died. So this is police brutality. So the question, I guess, I will pose to you, but you don't have to answer down below or anything. The question is, what are African Americans supposed to do here? What is their alternative? We know what they're going to do. But before you get to the part where they burn down the city, you might want to ask yourself, what could they have done to improve these conditions? Could they move? Go to the suburbs? No. Okay. Could they just work harder? Well, you got to get a job. But we know where are the jobs? Going to the suburbs, moving overseas. Okay. And you think about the type of jobs that are left, right? So manufacturing jobs are now moving to the suburbs. Service jobs are now reserved for people with college degrees. And if you can't go to school and you can't get a college degree, what jobs are left available to you? Low skill, right? Retail service jobs, right? Janitors, cooks, bellboys, waiters, right? Cashiers. It's not enough. Okay. So can't just work harder because no matter how hard you work, right, your pay is low. Can you vote? And again, guys, think about that. How can you somewhat get a law passed when you don't have enough votes, when you are not the majority? Right? African Americans, total 15%. How do you convince white America that it is in their best interest to invest in your community? Right? So for example, how do somewhat African Americans in Oakland, in Vallejo, okay, convince white Americans in Atherton, Saratoga, Los Gatos, Los Altos, okay, to pay higher taxes so that way government can provide education, services, jobs to help African Americans? How do you do that? Okay, so you can't just vote your way out. Okay, and then on top of that, right, you're watching your society decaying right in front of you. Not enough homes are built. Your community is getting bigger and bigger, right? Because more African Americans are moving in from the South, okay? So you have a lack of housing, a bigger population, lack of jobs, facilities and housing decaying all around you. And then to make things even worse, you got the cops, instead of enforcing the law, they are now killing your own people. So what do you do? What alternative do you have? Right? And this gets at the heart of the urban riots. Because if you look at it, so here's where I want to talk about the Watts riot in 1965. So the Watts riot in 1965, from 1940 to 1965, LA County's Black population increased from 75,000 to 650,000. That's almost a 10-time fold an increase in population. So that's that Great Migration, guys, continuing after World War II. Now, most African Americans in the county live in the southeast portion of the city of LA. But the southeast portion, so Watts, Compton, that was home to some of the most failing schools. It had very low access to public transportation. And as a result, Black residents struggle to somewhat obtain their education and somewhat get around so then they can go to work. And to make things even worse is that there was a government studies on Watts in 1947 in which the City Planning Commission called Watts an obsolescent area in which all of social and physical weaknesses of urban living are to be found. Basically, it's a shithole. I mean, to borrow the words of Donald Trump describing African countries, they're describing Watts as basically, anything that's bad about society, you can find in the city of Watts. And then by 1960, the increased population was made even worse when the city decided to demolish part of Watts to make way for a freeway entrance or a freeway system. So this is basically the American version of the Berlin Wall, right? So it's very similar to that wall I show you in Detroit, but they built it right in the middle of Watts, okay? So you have urban renewal, the interstate system coming in. By 1960, because of deindustrialization, 65% of the Black population in Watts, under 25, was unemployed. They didn't have a job. I mean, you think about it right now, guys. We're in a pandemic. I really love the meme. I think I saw a meme somewhere on Twitter. It says something along the line like, oh, y'all out of a job for 2 weeks. You don't know where your next paycheck is coming from, right? And you guys are freaking out. And it says something like, well, welcome to Black America or something of that nature. But all jokes aside, guys, I think what the pandemic right now, unemployment is, you're talking about 26 million unemployed. We're borderlining double digits right now, and people are freaking out. Unemployment in Watts was at 65%. That means 2 out of 3 Black working able bodies was out of work under the age of 25. 40% of those had, 40% of those had no jobs at all. So I want to be clear with my statistics here. The 65% under 25, those are what you call unemployed. Underemployed, meaning that they're working at a job that they're way qualified for, okay? It's a low-paying job, and 40% of the 2/3 was unemployed. Make a long story short, guys, really high unemployment rate. And to make things even worse, even though this was LA, and California is known for its progressive ideas, liberal, it's not the South, right, guys? The city of LA itself, by 1960, was actually, it ranked number 3 in terms of the most racially segregated city outside of the South. Number 3. It ranked behind Chicago and Cleveland as the most racially segregated city in America, meaning that the Blacks live over here, the whites live over here. That's how it works. So the question becomes, so what? So you have those terrible economic conditions, all of that pressure on the Black community. And then to make things even worse, August 11th, 1965, you have a California highway patrolman. He pulls over what was a reckless driver in the Watts area in LA. It's around after 7 o'clock. He pulls over a young African-American motorist. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. 21 years old, Marquette Fry, M-A-R-Q-U-E-T-T-E, Marquette Fry. Pulls him over, and Fry, he's drunk. But he's not belligerent or anything like that, but he does fail the sobriety test. It starts off actually very friendly. The cop performs the test on him. They kind of joke around, and the cop is just waiting for reinforcement. But African Americans nearby, they see what's happening and they gather. More than 50 had gathered to make sure that the police is going to somewhat cooperate and not somewhat use excessive force. So what you have eventually, what ends up happening is the police show up, African Americans show up, the Fry family show up. So you got the stepbrother, you got the mother. She jumps out of the car. And when she gets there, she starts to yell at her son for drinking and driving. So it's just chaotic, right? You got your mom yelling at you, Market Fry, he's drunk. You got the police showing up, right? They're trying to arrest Market Fry. And then you have African-American residents just like standing by. Guys, it's a recipe for disaster. Tension escalate as the CHP, they try to handcuff Market Fry, but he resists. And in that moment of resistance, his mother somewhat tried to come to his rescue, but the officer, he swung his baton and it hit Market Fryer in the shoulder, according to the report. He tried to swing for the shoulder, but according to the report, he missed and he struck Market Fry in the head. Fry ends up bleeding. Witnesses told others in the crowd that the police had abused Fry and his mother. That was later told to the LA Times. And because of this whole incident, more than 1,000 people started to show up on the scene as they watched the police arrest Market Fry and his mother, throw him in the back of the van and send them to somewhat in prison. After Fry was detained, the police arrested another couple, a man and a woman in the crowd, for allegedly for inciting violence. And as a result, rumor quickly spread throughout the community, spread that the woman that they had arrested was pregnant and she had been abused by the police officer. So it's a lot of just hysteria, false news that's spreading on both sides, right? But make a long story short, guys, it's a hot summer August night and all hell breaks loose. You got people throwing rocks at the police. You got crowds breaking into smaller groups. You got white motorists in the area being pulled over out of their car, being beaten. It's just all hell is breaking loose. Store windows are being smashed. The violence escalated from that night. As the officials try to remain calm the next day, even you have Renee Fry, who was the mother of Market Fry. She asked for the public to remain calm, but unfortunately, things only get worse by the second night. August 12th, more than 7,000 people took it to the streets, and once again, violence spreads. You got around 75 people injured, including 13 police officers, dozens of buildings burned to the ground. You have reports of rioters and looters using machetes, rifles, looting pawn shops. Just all hell is breaking loose. There are gunshots between the rioters and also the police themselves. And as a result, by the end of it all, you have Watts burning down in flames. More than 10,000 people were somewhat either arrested, detained. You have 13,000 National Guardsmen being called in just to somewhat to put things back to normal, right? To put an end to somewhat this riot. By the end of it all, 34 people dead, 1,300 people injured, 4,000 people were arrested, $40 million in property damages. And if you're wondering why all of that happened, was it just because of Market Fry? Market Fry was simply the fuse to the powder keg that existed in Watts because, again, those economic conditions, African Americans are frustrated. And to make these even worse, guys, in 1964, the state of California had passed a law. It was called the Rumsfeld Fair Housing Act. And what it did was it somewhat banned those discriminatory policies that was used to somewhat prevent African Americans from buying homes in the suburbs. So basically, it allowed African Americans to somewhat having access to homes, okay? It banned lenders and somewhat real estate agents, okay, from discriminating against African American buyers. So that was in 1964. It passed by the state legislatures. But then what ends up happening is they had a recall in 1965 that was lobbied and financed by the California Real Estate Agent Association and also Homeowner Association. And as a result, in 1965, you have a reversal, okay? That it's gonna go back to the old ways where sellers, lenders are able to decide who they want to sell to regardless of the color. So make a long story short, guys, seems like one step forward, you got 2 steps back. And that's the powder keg. That happens in Watts, okay? So I'm gonna share with you a link down below that will show you a clip from the Eyes on the Prize documentary that was done back in the 1980s as a way to somewhat highlight the civil rights movement. And it's excellent documentary. So I'd like you to somewhat review the segment that I'm assigning on the Detroit riot, because I'm not going to have enough time to explain to you the Detroit riot. The documentary does a better job at it. It shouldn't take you too long. It only takes about I think 10, 15 minutes. So I highly recommend, if you want to learn more information about the Detroit riot, check that video out. But I'm running a little long here in my first video, so I will pause it here for right now. So I will see you in the second half of this week's lecture. Thanks, guys.